The death of Mozart. Genius, poison, and a grave. Nobody can find. He was 35 years old at the height of his genius when his body began swelling so severely he couldn't lie flat in bed. He grew convinced someone was poisoning him and told people so directly, weeks before he actually died. When he was buried, nobody bothered marking exactly where, and to this day, no one knows precisely where Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's remains actually rest. By late 1791, Mozart was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most accomplished and productive composers in Europe, having spent the year completing an extraordinary volume of work, including the opera The Magic Flute, a clarinet concerto still considered one of the finest works ever written for the instrument, and beginning work on a Requiem Mass, a piece specifically commissioned under mysterious circumstances by an anonymous patron whose identity Mozart never learned during his lifetime, a detail that would later feed directly into decades of speculation about his death. In the final weeks of his life, Mozart's health deteriorated rapidly and severely. Contemporary accounts, including letters written by his wife Constanze and testimony from those who visited him during his final illness, describe symptoms including severe swelling throughout his body, particularly in his limbs, to the point where he reportedly couldn't turn over in bed without assistance, along with fever, vomiting, and a rash, a combination of symptoms that has fueled considerable modern medical speculation and debate regarding the actual underlying cause of his death, since 18th century medical record keeping simply didn't document illness with the precision modern diagnosis would require. What makes Mozart's death genuinely unusual as a historical case, beyond simply the loss of a genuinely significant creative genius at a young age, is that Mozart himself, according to multiple accounts from people present during his final illness, became personally convinced he was being deliberately poisoned, reportedly telling his wife directly that he believed someone had given him aquatofana, a slow-acting poison with a notorious historical reputation in Italy, and expressing the belief that he was writing his own Requiem, the very piece he was working on in his final weeks, specifically for his own funeral. This suspicion, whether or not it reflected any genuine underlying reality, found a specific, enduring target in the decades following Mozart's death: Antonio Salieri, an older, established composer at the Viennese court who had a documented professional rivalry with Mozart, competing for the same patronage, positions, and public recognition throughout much of Mozart's career in Vienna. Rumors that Salieri had poisoned Mozart out of professional jealousy began circulating within years of Mozart's death and persisted for centuries afterward, gaining particularly widespread cultural traction following the 1830 stage play Mozart and Salieri by Alexander Pushkin, and later, considerably more significantly, through the 1984 film Amadeus, which dramatically popularized the poisoning theory for a massive modern audience, despite the film itself being explicitly presented as fictionalized dramatic interpretation rather than documented historical fact. Modern historians and medical researchers examining the actual historical evidence have generally concluded the Salieri poisoning theory lacks credible historical support. Salieri himself, later in life, reportedly denied any involvement, including during a period of mental decline in his final years when he was reported, likely inaccurately given the documented unreliability of second-hand accounts from that specific period of his health, to have confessed to the murder, claims that were never substantiated and that most Mozart scholars now regard as considerably more reflective of the poisoning rumor's persistent cultural power than any genuine historical confession. The two composers, despite their professional rivalry, are documented to have collaborated on at least one occasion and maintained what historical correspondence suggests was a considerably more cordial, professionally respectful relationship than the popular poisoning narrative would suggest. Medical historians examining Mozart's documented symptoms through the lens of modern medical knowledge have proposed numerous alternative non-poisoning explanations for his death, including rheumatic fever, a streptococcal infection leading to kidney failure, trichinosis from undercooked meat, and a range of other period-appropriate illnesses that could plausibly explain his specific combination of documented symptoms, though no single theory has achieved definitive universal consensus among researchers studying the case, given the fundamental limitations of diagnosing a specific historical illness based entirely on second-hand contemporary descriptions rather than any surviving physical or medical evidence. What deepens the mystery surrounding Mozart's death considerably is what happened to his remains immediately afterward. Mozart was buried in a common grave at St. Mark's Cemetery outside Vienna, a burial practice that, contrary to popular assumption fueled partly by dramatized depictions in later films, wasn't necessarily an indication of poverty or social disgrace, but reflected standard Vienna's burial regulations of the era for individuals outside the wealthiest aristocratic classes, which mandated simple, unmarked common graves specifically to encourage efficient land use within the city's cemeteries. However, this standard practice meant that Mozart's exact grave location was never precisely documented or marked at the time of burial, and by the time later admirers attempted to identify and properly memorialize his final resting place decades afterward, the specific location had already been lost, with cemetery workers having reused and reorganized common graves in the intervening years according to standard period practice. A skull long claimed by various parties to be Mozart's has been the subject of periodic scientific examination over the following centuries, including DNA analysis conducted in the 2000s, though these tests ultimately proved inconclusive, unable to definitively confirm or rule out the skull's authenticity given the absence of any confirmed, directly comparable genetic sample from Mozart's known relatives, leaving even this specific physical claim in permanent, unresolved historical limbo. What makes Mozart's death endure as one of history's most persistently mythologized cases isn't necessarily genuine historical uncertainty about the broad medical cause, since most serious modern researchers favor some form of natural illness over deliberate poisoning, but the specific combination of factors that made the poisoning legend so culturally durable regardless: a documented professional rivalry, Mozart's own genuine documented suspicion voiced in his final weeks, and the death of a singular creative genius at a tragically young age, a combination that made a dramatic murder narrative considerably more culturally satisfying than the more mundane, though still genuinely tragic, reality of an 18th century illness modern medicine could likely have treated with relative ease. More than 2 centuries later, one of history's most significant musical geniuses lies in a grave whose exact location remains genuinely, permanently unknown, having died convinced he was being murdered, in a case where the actual medical truth may never be definitively separated from the legend that grew up around it specifically because the true, mundane explanation felt too small for the scale of the genius the world had lost. If stories like this, where even the death of history's greatest minds resists a fully certain explanation, are exactly what you come here for, subscribe to The Grave Details, because history holds more stories like this than most people will ever know.